The rescue party returns. The rhythmic slap of water against the hull of the rented John boat sounded like a funeral drum. The engine, a sputtering, rusted outboard motor that Stephan had spent an hour jury-rigging, coughed plumes of blue smoke into the damp, heavy night air. Sarah sat at the bow, her knuckles white as she gripped the gunwale. The mist rising off the lake wasn't natural. It swirled in thick, serpentine coils, clinging to the water like a shroud. It felt as though the lake itself were trying to hide the island, guarding the secrets of the house that stood at its center. "Cut the engine," Sarah whispered. Stephan, his face pale and slick with sweat, yanked the cord. The silence that followed was worse than the mechanical coughing. It was a suffocating, absolute quiet, no crickets, no bullfrogs, just the sound of their own shallow breathing. "We're close," Shelley said from the middle bench, her voice barely a tremor. She clutched a flashlight as if it were a talisman, though she hadn't dared turn it on yet. "I can see the silhouettes of the trees." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes straining against the gloom. The island didn't look like a patch of land. It looked like a jagged, rotting tooth rising from the dark throat of the lake. The house, the forgotten house, loomed above the shoreline, its windows dark, sightless eyes. It didn't belong to the landscape. It felt like a puncture wound in the fabric of reality. "Remember the plan," Sarah said, her voice hard. "We move as a unit. We find Rachel, we get her to the boat, and we do not stop for anything. If you see movement, you don't investigate. You run." "And if it's not human?" Nick asked. He was sitting toward the back, his posture unusually rigid. He hadn't said much since they left the docks, his focus entirely on the dark expanse ahead. "Then you run faster," Sarah replied. She reached into her jacket and felt the cold steel of the crowbar she'd hidden inside. It felt pathetic, a piece of construction equipment against whatever had taken Rachel. But it was all she had. She looked back at her friends, Amanda, who was shaking, Stephan, trying to maintain a brave face, Christine, who had her eyes squeezed shut, praying under her breath. They were kids from the mainland, urban explorers and friends, out of their depth in an ocean of nightmare. The boat drifted, carried by a current that felt purposeful, as if the water were pulling them toward the landing. The bow scraped against the gravel of the shoreline with a sound like grinding teeth. Sarah didn't wait. She vaulted over the side, her boots sinking into the muck of the shore. She offered a hand to Amanda, pulling her onto the slick rocks. The air here was freezing, tasting of ozone and wet copper. It made the hair on her arms stand up. "It smells like decay," Christine whispered, stumbling as she hopped off the boat. "Stay close," Sarah commanded. She flicked her own flashlight on, a narrow, defiant beam that cut through the fog. The path up to the house was overgrown with brambles that seemed to reach out like hooked fingers, snagging their clothes. Every step felt like a betrayal of their survival instinct. Sarah felt the island's weight pressing down on her shoulders, a psychological pressure that whispered for her to turn back, to leave this place to the silence. But she thought of Rachel, the laugh they'd shared only hours ago, the sheer terror in the voice message she'd left before the line went dead. As they reached the base of the massive, sagging porch, the house let out a groan, a deep, structural shift of wood and iron that vibrated through the ground. "It's not just abandoned," Nick muttered, his gaze fixed on the front door, which hung slightly off its hinges. "It's hungry." Sarah ignored the dread knotting in her stomach. She stepped onto the porch. The floorboards were slick with something dark, a viscous residue that coated the wood. She shone her light down, and her breath hitched. Deep, jagged gouges scarred the floor, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged across the wood, or something with claws. "Sarah," Stephan whispered, pointing his light toward the corner of the porch. There, caught on a splintered piece of railing, was a scrap of fabric. A piece of Rachel's flannel shirt. It was torn, soaked in blood that was already turning dark and tacky in the cold. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of mounting panic and white-hot rage. She picked up the fabric, the scent of Rachel's perfume still clinging faintly to the fibers, masked by the metallic tang of the kill. "She was here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She looked up at the gaping black maw of the doorway. "She's inside." "We shouldn't go in there," Amanda breathed, her voice breaking. "Sarah, this isn't a rescue anymore. Look at this." "It is exactly a rescue," Sarah snapped, turning to face them. The intensity in her eyes silenced them. "If we leave, she dies. If we stay, we might have a chance. I'm going in. If you want to run, run now. But I am getting her out." Nobody moved. The bond of their friendship, the loyalty they had forged in the years before this night, held them firm against the encroaching darkness. Sarah turned back to the house. She pushed the door with the end of the crowbar. It gave way with a mournful, rusted shriek that echoed deep into the bowels of the building. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of shadows. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of old dust and something sweeter, more sickening. Dust motes danced in her flashlight beam, but as she swept the light across the foyer, the beam caught something that made her freeze. The furniture was overturned. The walls were splattered with dark, spray-like patterns. And in the center of the room, leading toward a staircase that descended into the dark basement, were a set of footprints. Bare footprints. "Rachel?" Sarah called out. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the house. From the depths of the basement, a sound drifted up. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a rhythmic, wet sound, like a heavy object being dragged across stone. And then, a faint, garbled whisper that made the blood run cold in Sarah's veins. "Stop the..." Sarah didn't wait for her friends. She moved toward the basement door, her boots thudding heavily on the floor. She needed to reach her. She needed to fix this. But as she gripped the handle to the basement stairs, a shadow detached itself from the wall, a shape that moved with a predatory, unnatural grace, blocking the path. It wasn't human. It moved too fast, a blur of motion that defied the eye. "Drop the light," a voice hissed. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. Sarah pivoted, her flashlight beam catching a flash of vibrant, striking red hair. A man stood there, his skin pale as marble, his eyes reflecting the light like those of a nocturnal animal. A predator in a suit, perfectly composed amidst the carnage of the house. "Where is she?" Sarah demanded, raising the crowbar, though her arm trembled. The man smiled, revealing teeth that were just a fraction too sharp, a fraction too long. "She is exactly where she needs to be, Sarah. The ritual has begun. And you are just in time to witness the evolution." Behind Sarah, the rescue party gasped, the sound ragged and terrified. She knew then, the trap hadn't been set for Rachel. The trap had been set for all of them. And they had walked into it with their eyes wide open. The air inside the house didn't just smell of rot, it smelled of antiquity, of dust that had settled before the invention of the electric light. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the thick, stagnant air, revealing walls draped in peeling wallpaper that looked uncomfortably like flayed skin. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the erratic thumping of her own heart. Behind her, the rescue party moved with the clumsy hesitation of the doomed. Shelley clutched a heavy crowbar like a holy relic, while Stephan swept his halogen light across the decaying foyer, his breathing ragged. They reached the grand staircase, a skeletal structure of warped oak that groaned under their boots. At the top, the hallway stretched into a cavernous dark. A rhythmic sound began to pulse through the floorboards, a wet, dragging noise, like meat being pulled across gravel. "Rachel?" Sarah called out. The name sounded like a prayer and a plea. She didn't wait for the others. Sarah broke into a run, her boots hammering the floorboards. She reached a set of heavy, arched double doors at the end of the hall. They were partially ajar, held open by a jagged shard of wood. Sarah pushed the door wide. The room beyond was a makeshift infirmary of nightmares. Surgical trays were littered with rusted implements, and the center of the floor was stained a dark, oxidized brown. There, sprawled upon a moth-eaten settee, was Rachel. The sight of her was a jagged blade to Sarah's chest. Rachel was slumped in a posture of impossible exhaustion, her clothes shredded, her skin possessing the translucent, waxen pallor of a doll left too long in the rain. Her breath came in shallow, rattling hitches, the sound of lungs fighting for purchase in a dying machine. Rachel! Sarah lunged forward, discarding the crowbar as she dropped to her knees. She grabbed Rachel's shoulders, frantic, searching for the wound, for the pulse, for the girl she had known since childhood. Rachel's eyelids fluttered. They were bruised purple, rimmed with a glassy, unnatural film. When she looked at Sarah, the recognition was there, but it was drowned in a sea of agony. Her fingers, trembling and stained with soot, clamped onto Sarah's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. "Sarah, get out," Rachel rasped. The words were wet, blood bubbling at the corner of her lips. They don't want us to leave. They want us to stay. Forever." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah sobbed, her hands shaking as she tried to wipe the grime from Rachel's face. "We're leaving. All of us. We have the boat." The boat. Rachel let out a hollow, broken laugh that morphed into a jagged cough. "The water, it's not for us. It's for them." The shadows in the room surged, elongating against the walls as if the house itself were drawing a deep, predatory breath. Behind Sarah, the rescue party stood frozen at the doorway. Nick was staring into the corner of the room, his expression locked in a rictus of confusion, his body rigid as if gripped by invisible wires. "Sarah, we need to move." "Now," Stephan hissed from the threshold, his voice tight with the frantic edge of a man who realized he had run out of time. "I hear them. Below us. More of them. I can't carry her alone." Sarah shouted, her voice echoing in the hollow space. "Then we carry her together," Christine said, stepping into the room. Her courage was a brittle thing, but she didn't turn back. But as they reached for Rachel, the air in the room temperature plummeted, frosting the glass of their flashlights. A low, harmonic vibration began to hum through the floorboards, not a sound, but a frequency that made their teeth ache. The heavy, ornate door slammed shut on its own, the iron bolt sliding home with a final, resonant thud. "It's not a room," Nick said, his voice dropping into a strange, detached monotone. "It's a stomach." Sarah whirled around. "Nick? What are you talking about?" Nick didn't look at her. He was staring at the wall, his eyes tracking something that wasn't there. The architect didn't build this to house people. He built it to digest them. The ritual, it isn't just to change us. It's to anchor us. A shadow coalesced in the center of the room, not a man, but a swirling mass of cold, violet light. It began to solidify into a form, tall and impeccably dressed, the figure of a man with hair the color of dried blood. David. He didn't walk, he drifted, his feet barely grazing the floorboards. "Evolution is rarely painless, little creatures," David said, his voice smooth as polished bone. He smiled, and the ambient light seemed to bleed out of the room, drawn toward him. "You come here to rescue a friend, yet you fail to realize that she has already transcended. She is no longer the girl who played in the lake. She is the first stone in a foundation that will outlast your miserable, fragile civilization." Sarah shoved herself to her feet, abandoning caution. She grabbed a heavy, rusted candelabra from a side table, swinging it with all her might. David didn't even flinch. He caught the base of the iron fixture in one hand, the metal groaning as he crushed it like soft clay. "You are so very loud," David sighed, a look of bored disappointment washing over his face. "Such a pity. There was such potential in your resolve." He flicked his wrist. A kinetic wave, invisible and violent, slammed into Sarah, throwing her across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening crunch, the wind knocked out of her, her vision swimming in sparks of white and red. She slumped to the floor, struggling to draw air into her bruised lungs. Sarah. She heard her friends screaming, heard the sound of struggle, the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor. She saw the darkness reach out, vine-like tendrils of pure shadow coiling around the rescue party, pulling them down into the floorboards as if the house itself were liquid. "Don't worry," David whispered, leaning over her, his face a mask of predatory amusement. "You won't be alone for long. We have so much work to do, and eternity is such a long time to learn the rules." Sarah's vision dimmed. She looked at Rachel, who had slumped into a dead faint, and then at her friends, who were being dragged into the dark. Her last conscious thought wasn't of the pain or the monsters, it was of the girl she had been, the girl who had dared to cross the dark water. She closed her eyes as the cold finally claimed her, and the house began its work.